Salutations, everyone! Welcome back to another Total Warhammer 3 guide. I'm Lord Forwind, and today we're going to go over 10 tips on how to play the Vampire Coast better. Tip 1. Remember that your legendary lords and tech lords, by which I mean lords that you get through the legendary admiral tree, are in fact immortal, meaning losing them and their army is not the end of the world. It's the other non-immortal lords you need to be careful of. Using Immortal Lords, keeping them in the field, gets them more XP. So if you have a choice, always pick an Immortal Lord over a non-Immortal Lord. And don't be too terrified about losing armies. This faction, that's just something you have to accept. You're probably going to lose some armies. Tip 2. The Vampire Coast economy is not very good. They only have buildings that can only generate 360, a little bit more than that. Basically, you have no economy from buildings. So in order to make money, you have to use coves, which you can obviously place in enemy settlements to leech their money, treasure quests, which you can get from your maps, as well as battles to generate most of your money. Thankfully, you have the ability to raise troops very quickly and plenty of them because you're a undead vampiric faction, but that means you need a good pool of money. So it's not abnormal for the Vampire Coast to not play at their limit in terms of money, as in make sure that you are still making some money each turn, but you may not want to build to your army capacity all the time. It's just a little tip there, but money, it can be a bit of a struggle for this faction for new players. Your money comes from offense and coves, not from defense and buildings. Tip 3. Continuing on the theme of an offensive vampiric pirate faction, your defense as the Vampire Coast is laughable. You're one of the worst defensive factions in the game. Your garrisons here are literally trash. They're basically equivalent to zombie mob units, slightly better. So what this means is defense is very difficult for you. You're not going to be able to rely on your garrisons to hold off anything. On the other hand, you have vampiric corruption, which, although I argue that attrition needs to be higher in this game, will help. You want to build the corruption line here and start spreading corruption out to any of your lands that you own. They should be at max. It also helps with public order, but also having corruption in the enemy's lands, if you can get it high enough, means they can't just freely march to your land quickly. They either have to go slow, giving you time to build up a defense, or if they start to move very quickly into your land, they will suffer plenty of attrition. So you're terrible at defense, but if you have enough vampiric corruption, you are slightly better at it. You're still really bad though. But it can help, especially at higher levels, to know that you do have some defensive ability. It's just really bad. Tip 4. You have access to the instant Raising Dead ability where you get full armies. Make sure that you use that to attack and defend from odd angles. The Vampire Coast, just like the Vampire Counts, have the ability to raise a lord in even one of their minor settlements and instantly have them built up to a very high level. It can help on defense if the enemy is invading, plus your corruption, you may have a chance of holding the settlement. If not, you'll force them to take plenty of casualties. But also you can stage an attack from even a minor settlement. It's quite easy for you to move in, take a single settlement, raise another lord, raise a secondary army, and all of a sudden you've got an invasion force. So sniping an enemy settlement and then raising huge forces from it, totally something you can do. Very strong in multiplayer because it means enemies can't let you get, can't allow any of your lords to approach their coastline or anything. Otherwise they could have a full army on their doorstep. It is not a bad strategy, especially if you're going to play multiplayer, to just have one or two lords just randomly near the enemy territory. They will be forced to either hunt you down or just keep armies around to keep an eye on you. If you do this strategy, though, make sure that you do it with one of your legendary admirals so that you don't lose all their progress if they die. Tip 5. Although the Vampire Coast sounds very fun, the biggest problem a lot of people have, and I struggle with still at times, is knowing the lines of fire on your units. So many people are used to playing with archers whose arrows curve so they can shoot over units and over terrain. The Vampire Coast, on the other hand, uses guns. And the downside of guns is they go in a straight line. They don't have the ability to go around terrain. So if the enemy is even slightly higher than you, it is very hard for you to shoot them. Also, if the enemy is too far below you, it can also be hard for you to shoot. So make sure before you bring these guys into too many battles or even multiplayer, you do know how to use guns, where to station them, how to flank with them, how to use the overlapping lines of fire. They're a very complex faction for such a simple premise of vampires with guns. Lines of fire will screw you over more than anything else. I can't count the amount of times that I had some of the elite vampire coast deck gunners, for example, walking into range because the enemy was just a little bit over a hill. You have to pay very close attention to where your units are and how they fire. Tip 6. The Vampire Coast has relatively terrible melee units. Mainly their infantry, because they don't have cav. They're there to slow down the enemies so that your ranged units with guns can attempt to kill, and your artillery can definitely kill them. Just be aware that even the elite Vampire Coast infantry here, their depth guards with polearms, they're not terrible units, and they will start to get kills, but everything else you have is pretty much meat shields. They literally have the meat shield trait, meaning they won't really do much damage. The game is literally telling you, don't rely on melee armies as this faction. You do have some monstrous units that are slightly better in melee combat, but it's not till you start to get into your monsters, your big ones, single error, 6, 7 entity armies, that you'll actually be able to kill things with melee units. And even so, you have access to mortars and carronades, as well as some of these missile monsters towards the late game. These are where you're going to get kills. That is just the reality of it. Ranged units and artillery are how you get kills. You're not going to win in melee combat versus anybody except for maybe like the Skaven or the Vampire Counts. Seriously, your melee infantry is really bad at getting large amounts of kills. It's there to slow down the enemies. You can make it work. Some people do. Don't put yourself through the pain. Just use ranged units and artillery. And tip 7, similar to all the undead factions plus Nurgle, flaming weapons are a problem for you because you're a healing faction. You rely on keeping your units alive longer in combat so that they kill people over time rather than killing them quickly. This means any enemy that can bring flaming weapons, Khorne is the biggest culprit, but the dwarves and other factions that have access to the lore of fire on their mages will also be a problem for you. And unlike some of the other ones that function with healing, superior melee units are a serious problem for this faction. If the enemy shows up with their elite infantry, I'm thinking of one memorable battle where Norska showed up with an army of berserkers, your melee units are going to die extremely quickly. Their meat shieldness is far less than the other healing type factions. So just be aware, those are the type of factions where not getting into melee combat is probably your smartest move. Be aware that those guys are a real threat. In multiplayer, expect to see plenty of fire. But even in campaign, you can be very shocked when an enemy army that looks inferior to you in terms of quality units massacres you because they have a couple good infantry units in the mix. Okay, tip 8. Make sure you use healing spells to keep mainly your monster units alive as long as possible. You can spend healing on some of your meat shield unit. Obviously, if the enemy brings superior melee, you're kind of screwed. But you could afford to throw some healing on depth guard. But your biggest strength of all is going to come when you throw healing on some of your single or low entity units. Moringles here will actually be able to do some damage in melee combat, but more importantly, they will tie up the enemy units, especially if they bring superior melee units, longer than your infantry will. It's much more important to keep your monstrous units alive than it is to keep your melee infantry units alive. Some of your elite units, like your Necrofex Colossus or your Rotting Prometheans, Rotting Leviathans, will do significant damage in melee, and the enemy will cluster around them. And because they're low entity unit, if the enemy clusters around them, it allows your ranged units to shoot into them better. Now, the problem with large entity unit meat shield units, like your zombie deckhands and stuff, is that sometimes they will block your range units from being able to shoot because your units would be shooting into the back of their own. And there's some weird interactions where sometimes they'll shoot, sometimes they won't. But low entity units, the enemy actually surrounds, or mostly surrounds, is actually better because then you can, in fact, shoot. Tip 9. Some of the spells that your heroes and spellcasting units can provide, as well as your support ones, will boost your range units to amazing combat levels. It's something that new people to this faction have to be aware of. Many factions you can get away without boosting your units through spells, instead using spells that do damage. While the Vampire Coast does do damage with spells, they also have the ability to boost their range units. That's not a spellcaster. There we go. Some of these people here, this one's not a good example either. You do have access to spellcasters. Let's see, one of them up here, your Vampire Deep one has some decent boosts as well. This one, Spiteful Shot, is definitely worth mentioning. So Vampire Fleet Captain, Lore of the Deep, will add 90% accuracy as well as magical attacks to your range units. This means they will wreck enemies that are weak to magic, but also they will actually hit things. The Vampire Coast, despite all their range units, they're not necessarily the most accurate spellcasters, so you do have to be aware of the fact that they do struggle at times to aim properly. But once they do aim properly, they will do plenty of damage. And there's other ones here. Fog of the Damned is worth mentioning to weaken the enemy so that your melee units survive. But really, this Spiteful Shot might be one of my favorite spells to use as this faction. The large boost to accuracy is considerable. Your vampire, your gunnery wights can boost enemies nearby. Boost your range units nearby to be missile piercing damage, as well as enchanted ballistics you can use as not a spell, as an ability to boost both accuracy and reload speed. Combining those two, you can make even their amateurish zombie range units do significantly more damage, but really use it on your stronger ones and you'll do much better. Buffs is definitely a necessity on this faction. And tip 10, get your artillery early as this faction and use it for the entire game. You only have access to 3 artillery units, but they are good artillery units. They all have long range. They all do decent damage. Mortars are non-straight shots, which is really nice in a faction where basically everything has to be in a line of fire. Your carronades here can absolutely wreck enemy large units. Monsters and stuff is great. And Queen Bess is just a phenomenal siege artillery unit. Does significant damage, low amount of ammunition, but remember you have abilities that enhance both accuracy as well as replenish ammunition. Bring 1 or 2 of these. You get the Queen Bess through rituals, so that's important. Curse of the Queen's Cannon, once you get to rank 12 as your faction leader, basically every army should have a Queen Bess in it because it makes such a significant difference. Get them early, even your mortars, and use them. They make a significant difference in your ability to kill things. Hitting enemies from long range as a faction that sucks in melee is kind of your whole faction concept, really. You don't want to get into combat unless you absolutely have to. Shooting the enemy and then running away is great. Sadly, you're not capable of skirmishing, so you have to shoot and hope the enemy doesn't get to you. And that's it for this guide. Hopefully this helps you play the Vampire Coast more. They're a really good faction. Their weakness is battles. The less you rely on actually fighting battles yourself and can do auto-resolves, I recommend that, because fighting with them, unless you learn lines of fire, can be very difficult. So anyway, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe if this helps you. Leave your own advice below. People do really appreciate that. And I will see you guys all in another Let's Play or guide. Bye for now.